Hi, I'm Sarah Henry. I'm the Museum of the City of New York's Robert A. and Elizabeth Roane Jeffy Chief Curator and Deputy Director. And the first object I'm going to be talking about is this painting by John Sloan, which is on view behind me, about a Chelsea rooftop. This painting is installed in a portion of the exhibition that we call Private Refuges. And we got really interested in what the role of the rooftop is in our dense urban environment, thinking of it as a destination that is both public in a way and private. It's personal, but it also gives you a view of the city and an unusual perspective. So I really fell in love with this painting because it captures a kind of quality of the early 20th century city where the rooftop has a meaning as a domestic workspace, but also as a place of escape. So John Sloan is one of our most important urban painters. He was part of a whole movement in the early 20th century that was considering urban scenes and the lives of ordinary people as worthy of being portrayed in art. So I love the way the figures interact with the built-in and natural environment, and the way that you have the central figure, which is the woman with the fluttering laundry, but you also get the little fragment of somebody who's reclining and reading, a little girl enjoying the freedom of being up in the air and interacting with the pigeons as well as the pigeon keeper himself. I've always been interested in the way that rooftops get used by different classes of people. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, the rooftop was not like the privileged place to be. Higher up floors were worse floors in tenements because there were no elevators and you had to climb stairs. And bringing laundry up to a rooftop was really hard work. We now think of roof access as something that's like a perk, but it was a place of work and a serious burden for a lot of people. But Sloan depicts this scene with such joy because I think that's part of what his work is about. He was very politically motivated around ideals about uplift of working people and socialism, but he was not interested in thinking about his subjects as downtrodden. He was looking for moments of joy. So this object is in the collection of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College. So many important museums, including the Hood Museum, were so supportive of this show, wanting to help us as the Museum of the City of New York to celebrate our anniversary and to give a really rich and robust depiction of how New York has been shown in art. It starts with conversations with the curators and the collection staff, and then a letter to their director asking if they would consider loaning it to our exhibition. So we were really gratified with the warm response that we got from the Hood Museum and the privilege of showing this work here, a painting of New York to New Yorkers in the Museum of the City of New York. I hope that when people look at this work that they feel the empathy that John Sloan felt for his subjects and the feeling of identification that you can have, but also that they have a chance to just admire the skill and draftsmanship and composition of this, because there's so many beautiful touches to it. And I hope that they can feel the sort of personal investment that the artist felt in considering the role of these very special spaces in our urban fabric. The next piece I want to talk about is a masterpiece by the artist Faith Ringgold, which is called Woman on a Bridge #1. It's a story quilt that tells the story that eventually became the children's book, Tar Beach. And it is a massively scaled quilt that embeds the story of a little girl named Cassie Lightfoot into an environment that shows her up on the tenement rooftop in her Harlem home, but also projects her into the sky as she imagines herself lifted above the city and kind of sailing over the George Washington Bridge. So it's a story unto itself. It's a painting, it's a quilt, it's a multimedia piece that has really spoken to generations. When we were planning This Is New York and we were thinking about destinations, I have to say that the aspiration to bring Tar Beach into the show is one of the first things that came into my mind. I don't think anything has captured that idea of finding and laying claim to pieces of the city and that very emotional experience the way that Tar Beach has. Also, the importance of Faith Ringgold can't be overstated. She's somebody who the museum has honored with its Louis Auchincloss Award. She is somebody who has channeled New York, been part of the arts scene here, the Black art movement. She grew up in the Harlem Renaissance, and she attributes a lot of her artistic practice to having grown up in Harlem during that time period. So she's really a quintessential New Yorker who has laid claim to New York in her own very, very distinctive way. So there are actually multiple versions of this story quilt, Tar Beach. And so we were really happy when the Guggenheim Museum agreed to lend it to us. And they really felt it was important that it be part of the show. So we were really grateful for that. Fabric, things being what they can be on view for a time, but a limited time, because they can't be exposed to light and air for extended periods. So we're thrilled that we were able to open with this version of Tar Beach, and then it will go back home to the Guggenheim, and it will be replaced by another version, a silkscreen version, that we're borrowing from the Fabric Museum and Workshop. So to bring an object like this and of this standing on loan means the work of the registrars and the collections managers, the art handlers, the installers, the shippers, comes in its own big, robust crate that needs to acclimatize to the new environment. We need to make sure that the light levels are just right for it. So it really takes a whole team, an entire museum, especially to bring an object of this stature and just sheer physical size into the museum. The story that gets told in Tar Beach is an incredible, very specific, but very New York story in which it's sort of semi-autobiographical for Faith Ringgold, her fictional heroine, goes up to the rooftop of what they're going to the beach, right? They're going, but the beach is made of tar because it's just the rooftop of their building, but it's an incredible refuge, a place apart. And the idea that they're on the beach is actually similar to what John Sloan and other artists did. John Sloan did many works in which he had people sunbathing, for example. And I think having that personal relationship to major pieces of the built environment is actually one of the signature experiences of New York. I think we each know these big pieces of infrastructure, these landmarks, but we know them in a kind of grand level, but also in an intimate level. The reason I selected these two objects to speak about together is because we're looking here at two artists who were a generation or more apart, but they each were, despite their differences, they were each reckoning with something very similar in a way. John Sloan's case, he had been fascinated with the seething urban life of crowded New York neighborhoods and then the somewhat quieter version on the rooftops. He began to be fascinated by that in the early 20th century at a time that the city was being transformed by massive immigration from mostly Eastern and Southern Europe. And he was looking with great sympathy on how they were navigating and making a life for themselves in these new circumstances and in this very, very dense place. Faith Ringgold's family was displaced by the Great Migration, and they were part of another great movement that came to New York. But her perspective is different, not just because of the time that this takes place, but also because she's telling the story from her own point of view. So John Sloan was observing with great empathy, but Faith Ringgold is speaking from firsthand experience, and she's capturing a very distinctive moment in the city's history and in her own life and in American history, to be honest. They're dealing with hard topics in a lot of ways, but both resist the idea of they're telling stories of victimhood. They're finding the places where people make lives for themselves, lives of joy and family and friends. Even if they're maybe facing adverse circumstances, that's not the topic of their work. I think they're also both very interested in this three-dimensional quality of the city and how the built environment relates to the spaces between and above buildings, which I think is really, really interesting. And then just this idea of these places in between. Both of these artworks speak to the idea that we can be alone together. We can be outside and inside. We can be in these places where they have ambiguous status. These spaces liminal, it's the edges. And that in those spaces, you can find a kind of liberation. So I love pairing them together because it shows that across so many differences of different kinds of art, different eras, different profiles of the artists, different concerns that they might have, there's still these threads of New York City history and the built environment and just that urban condition that continue to reward the artist's eye and to engage artists as they try to think about what's the nature of urban life in this most dense of American cities. One of the goals of this exhibition was to be disruptive in terms of what we think of as a museum object and how we think of the idea of depiction, and to juxtapose artworks and pop culture from different eras and different genres with each other, to shake things up a little bit, to make the experience of thinking about how people have looked at New York, to take it out of a kind of pristine art history context and think of it as something that we all participate in, that we all consume, that we all absorb, and that we also partake of as we look around. So to me, it's very empowering for people. It takes art off a high pedestal, and it also gives us a chance to see, just as we've been comparing and contrasting today, how the things that are the same about the city can be interpreted in so many different ways by so many different people, but we all have something in common, which is New York.